In the vast golden grasslands of the Serengeti, where the ancient rhythm of life and death unfolds beneath the endless African sky, a lioness named Django had just endured the most devastating loss any mother could bear. The morning sun cast long shadows across the savanna as she stood beside the lifeless bodies of her two cubs, their small forms still warm, but forever silent. The attack had come at dawn, an alliance of 3 massive female lions from a rival pride. Their black manes bristling with aggressive territorial fury had swept through her small family like a merciless storm. Django's amber eyes, once bright with the fierce joy of maternal love, now reflected only emptiness and grief. Her powerful frame, built for hunting and protection, now felt hollow and meaningless. For 3 days, she had refused to leave the place where her children fell, their scent still lingering in the wind, like a cruel reminder of what she had lost. The other lionesses in the pride had tried to coax her away, but Django remained motionless, her maternal instincts burning like an unquenchable fire with no outlet for their intensity. On the morning of the 4th day, driven by an inexplicable restlessness, Django finally began to wander. Her large paws carried her across the sun-baked earth through scattered acacia trees and rocky outcrops with no destination in mind. The savanna stretched endlessly before her, teeming with life that seemed to mock her own emptiness. Zebras grazed peacefully in the distance, their foals playing safely beside their mothers. Thompson's gazelles bounded through the grass with their young, and even the distant elephants walked in herds with their calves carefully protected by the adults. The world continued its endless cycle of nurturing and protection, while Django walked alone, her heart a wasteland of grief. Her wandering eventually led her away from the familiar dry grasslands toward the winding path of the Mara River, a lifeline that cut through the savanna like a silver serpent. The landscape began to change as she approached the water. The golden grasses gave way to lusher vegetation, thick reeds, and muddy banks where hippos usually congregated in their massive pods. The air here was different, heavy with moisture and the rich, earthy smell of river life. Not far from the riverbank, hidden among the tall papyrus reeds near a shallow bend in the water, another tragedy was unfolding. A baby hippo named Tumba, only 3 months old, was crying pitifully with heart-wrenching sounds echoing through the morning air. The little one's gray-pink skin glistened with moisture, but was covered in dried mud and scratches from the sharp reeds. His large brown eyes, wet with tears, reflected pure terror and desperate loneliness. Tumba's mother had been killed by a massive Nile crocodile just 2 days earlier during a violent territorial dispute at the river's edge. The attack happened with horrifying speed. A sudden thrashing of water, the terrible death roll, and then only the crimson stain spreading across the river's surface. The memory of that moment was seared deeply into Tumba's young mind, a profound trauma that made every ripple in the water seem threatening, every shadow beneath the surface a potential monster. The hippopod, though distressed by the loss, had to move upstream to safer waters where crocodiles were less aggressive. In the harsh world of the wild, the survival of the entire group was more important than one individual, especially a calf too young to keep up with the pod's necessary migration. The matriarch of the pod had looked at Tumba one last time with sorrowful eyes, her massive body creating waves as she turned away. But then she led the group onward with the determination that only survival instinct could command. Tumba had tried to follow, his small legs struggling against the river current, his calls becoming more desperate with each passing moment. But eventually, exhausted and terrified of the deep water where his mother had died, he had crawled onto the muddy bank and stopped, watching his family disappear around the river bend. Now Tumba was completely alone, his cries echoing in pure desperation. Hunger and thirst had begun to torment his small body. Though water surrounded him, the instinct to return to the river where death had claimed his mother filled him with paralyzing fear. His primitive instinct told the little one that if no one came to help soon, his life would end right here, either from starvation, dehydration despite the nearby water, or from the predators that prowled these banks. The sound of those pitiful cries drifted on the wind and reached Django's ears as she was passing through the riverine vegetation. At first, she thought it was the cry of an injured prey animal, perhaps a young water buffalo separated from its herd. Her hunting instincts stirred slightly, but then something in those sounds made her stop. They carried the same desperate tone, the same longing for comfort and protection that she remembered from her own lost cubs. Though the sound was different, deeper and more resonant than a lion cub's mew, the emotion behind it was unmistakable. Django approached cautiously, her nose twitching as she scented the air. The smell of hippo was clear, strong and musky, but there was also something else. The scent of fear, loss, and absolute loneliness. When she pushed through the reeds and saw Tumba for the first time, her heart seemed to stop beating. The little one sat in the mud, his small rounded body trembling, weak cries emerging from his wide mouth. His tiny ears twitched at every sound, and his eyes, so full of innocent terror, searched desperately for the comfort of his mother. In that moment, everything should have proceeded according to nature's cruel laws. A hungry lioness, a helpless baby hippo far from the protective waters. This was the law of the grasslands, written in blood and survival over millions of years of evolution. Lions rarely attacked healthy adult hippos. Those massive creatures were far too dangerous with their enormous jaws and aggressive nature. But a lone calf, separated and vulnerable? This should have been an easy meal. But instead of hunting instincts, something deeper and more powerful awakened in Django's broken heart. Tumba's cries didn't just sound like her lost cub's calls. They were the very cries for help that she had been unable to answer when her own children needed her most. The raw emotion of a child calling for a mother who would never come again resonated through every fiber of her being. Django stood motionless for a long time, the mud squelching beneath her large paws, staring intently at Tumba with complex emotions swirling in her chest. The afternoon sun beat down intensely on them both, creating shimmering heat waves across the landscape, and in that suspended moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Part of her, the primitive instinctual lion part, whispered that this was food, that she should end the little one's suffering quickly and satisfy her own hunger. But another part, the mother in her, cried out with the voice of love and protection. This wasn't prey. This was a child in desperate need. Tumba, sensing the presence of something large and dangerous, looked up with his big round eyes wet with tears. Instead of the panicked fear that any hippo would normally have upon encountering a lion, something in Django's gaze, perhaps the pain of loss that both carried within them, kept Tumba from attempting to flee into the dangerous waters. Instead, the little one made a soft sound, almost a question, as if his instinct told him that this was not an enemy, but someone who could understand his pain. The standoff lasted for what seemed like an eternity. Django took one careful step forward, then another. Tumba tensed but didn't move. The lioness lowered her massive head, bringing her face close to the baby hippo, and gently, with infinite care, she nuzzled his mud-covered body. The touch was tender, questioning, a gesture that transcended species and spoke in the universal language of maternal care. With the absolute care that only a mother could show, Django began to clean Tumba with her rough tongue. She licked away the dried mud, the debris from the reeds, working with a patience and gentleness that seemed impossible from a creature built for hunting and killing. The baby hippo, starved for any form of comfort, leaned into her touch, his cries gradually softening into small whimpers of relief. But Django quickly realized that caring for a baby hippo would be vastly different from caring for lion cubs. Tumba couldn't climb onto her back like a smaller primate could. His body, though small for a hippo, was already dense and heavy, built for an aquatic life rather than terrestrial travel. Django circled him several times, trying to figure out how to provide the protection and transport he needed. Finally, she lay down beside him, creating a sheltered space between her body and a fallen log, a den of sorts where Tumba could feel enclosed and safe. The baby hippo, exhausted from his ordeal, immediately pressed against her warm fur, his small body fitting surprisingly well against her side. Django curled around him, her larger frame creating a protective barrier from the world. For the first time since his mother's death, Tumba felt safe enough to close his eyes. The first days were unimaginably challenging. Django had no idea how to care for a baby hippo. The first time Tumba cried from hunger, she tried offering fresh meat from an antelope she had just hunted. But the little one's herbivorous nature rejected it completely, and Tumba turned away, his distress growing. Django worried and was confused, not understanding why what nourished her own children would be refused by her new adopted child. Through careful observation and maternal instinct, Django gradually learned to find what Tumba needed. She watched what the baby hippo tried to eat on his own, noting when he reached for certain grasses and plants. She spent hours searching for the tenderest shoots of grass, pulling them up with her teeth and laying them before Tumba. She found patches of soft, aquatic vegetation near the water's edge and learned to harvest them despite her natural aversion to entering deep water. Water was perhaps the biggest challenge. Baby hippos needed to stay hydrated and their skin required regular moisture to prevent drying and cracking under the hot African sun. Django couldn't bring Tumba to the river. His fear of the water where his mother died was too intense, and her own instincts warned her of the crocodiles that lurked there. Instead, she found shallow pools and small tributaries where water collected in rocky depressions. She would lead Tumba to these spots, standing guard while he drank and rolled in the shallow water, his skin soaking up the necessary moisture. Django also learned to protect Tumba's sensitive skin from the harsh sun. During the hottest parts of the day, she would lead him to dense shade under acacia trees or into the shelter of rocky overhangs. She would lie beside him, her own body providing additional shade, panting in the heat but refusing to leave him exposed. Every time Tumba was hungry or distressed and cried, those sounds triggered Django's maternal instincts more powerfully than ever. She would immediately stop whatever she was doing, whether drinking water, resting, or even eating, to attend to him. Tumba's calls had become the most important sound in her world, more important than the roars of other lions or the calls of prey. She learned to distinguish his different cries: hunger, fear, discomfort, or simply the need for reassurance and comfort. The other lions in the area looked at Django with increasing bewilderment and deep suspicion. The first time a female from their group saw Django with Tumba, she growled a warning, thinking Django had lost her mind and might be dangerous to the entire pride. The sight was bizarre and unnatural, a lioness protecting what should be prey, albeit unusual prey. Others showed concern, but were also bewildered, not understanding why a lioness would care for a hippo calf instead of ignoring it or considering it a potential future meal when it grew larger. Some whispered that she was cursed or possessed, believing that grief had caused her to lose her lion nature entirely. There were discussions among the pride about whether Django should be driven out, whether her strange behavior might bring bad luck or danger to them all. The most aggressive members suggested that the hippo calf should be killed, both to end Django's strange obsession and to provide meat for the pride. But Django completely ignored the opinions of her own kind. When other lions approached with intentions to threaten or harm Tumba, she roared fiercely with sounds containing all the strength and determination of a mother protecting her child. Her mane bristled, fangs showed, and her entire body became an impenetrable barrier protecting her adopted child. She fought off two subadult females who tried to approach Tumba out of curiosity and aggression, driving them back with a ferocity that left no doubt about her commitment. Even the largest female lions had to back down before the ferocity of this maternal love. The pride leader, a massive lion with a dark mane, approached one day to investigate the strange situation himself. He circled Django and Tumba, his expression a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Django stood her ground, positioning herself between him and the baby hippo, her growl a clear warning. The female lion, perhaps recognizing something in her eyes, some depth of emotion that commanded respect, eventually turned and walked away, leaving her to her unusual charge. Day by day, Tumba grew stronger under his foster mother's care. The little one learned to read Django's moods and body language through subtle gestures. When she was alert, ears forward and body tense, he learned to be quiet and still. When she was relaxed, lying in the shade with her tail lazily twitching, he could explore nearby, pulling at grass and investigating the world with growing confidence. Tumba developed his own ways of showing affection to Django. His mouth, built for grazing, would gently nibble at her fur in a gesture of grooming and bonding. He would press his broad snout against her face, breathing in her scent, marking her as family. When they rested, he would position himself so that some part of his body always touched hers, needing that constant comforting physical connection to feel secure. Django also learned to communicate with Tumba using soft sounds she had never used with anyone else except her own biological children. Gentle rumbles to reassure, small warning calls when there was danger, and even a unique type of talking, a mix of chuffs and low roars that only the two of them could understand. Tumba responded with his own vocalizations, the grunts and squeaks of a young hippo that Django learned to interpret with a mother's intuition. As months passed through the changing seasons, the bond between them deepened remarkably in ways that defied natural explanation, becoming something that neither the laws of nature nor the wisdom of the eldest animals could adequately describe. Django adjusted her entire lifestyle around Tumba's needs. She hunted during the times when he was resting, never straying far, always within earshot of his calls. She found territories near water sources so that Tumba could access the moisture he needed, even though this sometimes meant competing with other predators who also frequented these areas. She protected him from threats that a mother hippo would never have to consider. Hyenas, drawn by the scent of the unusual calf, were driven off with savage attacks. A young leopard who thought the baby hippo might be easy prey learned a harsh lesson when Django appeared like a golden fury, chasing it up a tree and keeping it trapped there for hours. Even a lone buffalo, aggressive and territorial, was forced to retreat when it approached too close to where Tumba was grazing. The baby hippo, for his part, began to show personality traits that Django found endearing and sometimes amusing. Tumba was curious, often investigating things that Django thought were best left alone. He would approach dung beetles with fascination, watch birds with intense interest, and once tried to play with a monitor lizard, which Django had to quickly shoo away. He was also stubborn, a trait perhaps inherent to hippos. When he didn't want to move from a particular grazing spot, all of Django's nudging and gentle pushing would be met with resistance, his small body planted firmly in place. She learned to be patient with these moments, understanding that his will, though sometimes frustrating, was also a sign of his growing strength and confidence. After 6 months of living together, Tumba had grown considerably larger and healthier. From a weak, trembling baby hippo weighing perhaps 50 pounds, he had now become a robust young hippo weighing several hundred pounds. His skin had a healthy gray color, his eyes were bright with intelligence and confidence, and most importantly, he had learned how to survive in the harsh world of the savannah, adapted though it was for a creature meant for rivers. But as Tumba grew, deep natural instincts began to urge him toward water, toward his own kind. Django, with a mother's keen intuition, sensed this change in her adopted child. She saw Tumba increasingly drawn to the river sounds, the distant grunts and bellows of hippopods that traveled on the evening air. His eyes would light up with a longing she had never seen before, a longing to belong to a community with the same language, same habits, and same understanding of the world. Tumba would stand at the river's edge, no longer paralyzed by fear, but instead filled with an almost magnetic pull toward the water. He would wade into the shallows, submerging himself up to his eyes in a way that Django knew was natural for him, even though she herself would never fully understand it. He would stay there for hours, looking downstream toward where the pods congregated, his small ears twitching at every hippo call that echoed across the water. In the evenings, when both rested under Africa's star-filled sky, Django often saw Tumba gazing intently toward the horizon where the river curved out of sight, as if he were listening to calls that only he could hear. He would still come to her for comfort, pressing against her side, but there was a new restlessness in his gestures, a longing for something that even a mother's love couldn't provide. Though her heart ached as if being torn apart, Django understood that Tumba needed to live with his own kind to have a full and complete life. She had never been a young hippo, would never be one, and although she could provide him with safety and love, she couldn't teach him the complex social hierarchies, the aquatic skills, and the way of life that only his own species could transmit. She couldn't teach him to navigate the deep waters, to find the best grazing spots known only to hippos, or to understand the subtle communications of a pod. Most importantly, she understood that Tumba needed to be in the water, truly in it, not just at its edges. Hippos were creatures of the river, and to deny him that was to deny him his essential nature. She had given him survival, but now he needed to truly live. The decision to let go was the greatest act of love she could perform for him. It formed slowly in her heart over many days, each one more painful than the last. She began leading him on longer excursions toward the river, no longer pulling him back when he waded deeper. She would watch from the bank as he submerged completely, holding her breath in worry until he surfaced, snorting water from his nostrils, looking more at peace than she had ever seen him. One beautiful morning, as they were moving along the river's edge near a wide, calm section known for its large hippopods, Django heard the familiar calls of a massive hippo family nearby. That sound, the deep grunts, the splashing, and the social interactions of a healthy hippo community made Tumba immediately stop, his entire body quivering with attention and longing. His small ears perked up, rotating toward the sound, and his eyes held an expression of pure yearning. Django felt her heart breaking into pieces, but she knew this was the moment. She slowly walked to an open area on the riverbank where Tumba could be seen by the pod and could safely approach his own kind. The hippos in the water were already aware of their presence. Several large heads had surfaced, eyes and ears above the water, watching this impossible sight. A lioness and a young hippo together. Then, with all the will and strength she could muster, Django did something that went against every protective instinct in her body. She stepped back, creating distance between herself and Tumba. She lay down on the bank, her posture non-threatening, and with a soft sound that meant go, she encouraged him toward the water, toward his future. The moment of separation was the most painful and beautiful thing the savannah had ever witnessed. Tumba, as if understanding the meaning of this moment, didn't hurry toward the water. Instead, he turned back and approached Django one last time. With his wide mouth, he gently nuzzled every part of her face, her forehead, her cheeks, her nose, and finally her amber eyes that had looked at him with unconditional love for the past 6 months. Each gentle touch was a thank you, a goodbye, and a promise that he would never forget. His small grunts and whimpers conveyed emotions that transcended species: gratitude, love, and the sorrow of necessary parting. Django returned his affection, her large tongue stroking the gray skin she had cared for every day. In those licks, she conveyed all the love, blessings, and hopes that a mother could bestow. She silently prayed for him to have a long, happy life, full of love from his own kind, full of the cool water and the community that was his birthright. Finally, Tumba slowly stepped away from his foster mother's side and moved toward the water. Each small step was a tremendous effort of will, torn between the longing to belong and deep love for the one who had saved his life. At the water's edge, he paused one last time, looking back. Django raised her head, her eyes locked with his, and gave a final soft chuff of encouragement and blessing. Then Tumba entered the water. As he moved deeper, his body became more graceful, more at home. The awkwardness of his land movements disappeared as he submerged, swimming with an instinctive skill that had always been waiting to emerge. The pod watched carefully, and then something remarkable happened. The matriarch, perhaps the same one who had led the pod away months before, approached the young hippo. She circled him, sniffing, investigating, and then, in a gesture that made Django's heart soar even as it broke, she accepted him, her massive body providing shelter and welcome. Other hippos approached, younger ones who would become Tumba's playmates and companions, adults who would teach and protect him. Tumba looked back one more time through the water, his eyes finding Django on the bank, and then he turned fully toward his new family, toward his future. Django watched from the bank for hours, even as the sun climbed high and the heat became oppressive. She watched as Tumba was integrated into the pod, as he played with other young hippos, as he learned to navigate the deeper waters under the watchful eyes of the adults. She watched until she could no longer distinguish him from the others, until he had truly become one of them. In the weeks that followed, Django remained in the territory near the river, unable to fully leave. She would come to the bank during the early mornings and late evenings, the times when hippos were most active. She never called out, never tried to bring Tumba back, but she watched, needing to know that he was safe and happy. Sometimes, she would see him emerge from the water with the pod to graze at night. He was always surrounded by family, protected and loved. Once, she thought he had seen her watching from the shadows. He had paused in his grazing, his head turning in her direction, and for a long moment, they looked at each other across the distance. Then one of the adult hippos had grunted, and Tumba had returned to his grazing, to his life that no longer needed her constant presence. Finally, after many months of this twilight existence between her old life and her vigil over Tumba, Django found a new lion pride willing to accept her. The pride leader, an experienced female lion with a silver-tinged mane, had seen something special in her eyes, the depth of a mother who had known how to love unconditionally, who had learned that love transcends all boundaries. The pride had recently lost several members to disease and territorial conflicts, and they needed Django's strength and experience. She was welcomed, not as an outsider, but as a valuable addition. The other lionesses sensed something different about her, a wisdom and patience that set her apart. When Django finally gave birth to new cubs, healthy little lions full of vitality and fierce life, she realized that the time caring for Tumba had taught her invaluable lessons about the true meaning of motherhood. She learned that maternal love doesn't distinguish by skin color, species, or origin. It doesn't matter if your child has fur or thick gray skin, if they roar or grunt, if they hunt or graze. What matters is the connection, the commitment to nurture and protect. She learned that loving sometimes means letting go, and that the greatest sacrifice is allowing those we love to find their own happiness, even when it means living apart from us. The pain of separation from Tumba had been almost unbearable, but seeing him thriving with his pod had given her a peace that went deeper than her own desires. And most importantly, she learned that a mother's heart is large enough to contain love for all who need care, regardless of what species they belong to. Her love for Tumba didn't diminish her love for her new cubs. Instead, it had expanded her capacity for love, had deepened her understanding of what it meant to be a mother. She raised her new cubs with the lessons learned from raising Tumba. She was more patient, more attentive to their individual personalities and needs. She understood that each child was unique and required different approaches. She was fiercer in their protection, having learned that a mother's love must sometimes roar louder than any other force in nature. As her cubs grew, Django would sometimes tell them stories, in the way that lionesses do through play and demonstration. She would lead them on routes that passed by the river, and from a distance they would watch the hippopods. Her cubs didn't understand why their mother was so interested in these strange creatures, but they sensed it was important to her. One day, when her cubs were nearly a year old and strong enough to begin learning to hunt, Django led them to the river at dawn. There in the water, she saw Tumba, now a young adult hippo, powerful and confident. He was playing with younger calves, teaching them the ways of the water just as others had taught him. As if sensing her presence, Tumba looked toward the bank. Their eyes met across the water and the years. In that moment, everything they had shared passed between them. The desperate cries and the unexpected mercy, the days of learning and adaptation, the bond that had defied nature, and the bittersweet parting that had freed them both. Tumba rose slightly in the water, his head and shoulders visible, and he made a sound, a grunt of recognition and greeting that Django understood in her heart. She responded with a low, gentle roar, a mother's blessing. Her cubs looked up at her in confusion, but she simply nuzzled them and turned away from the river, leading them back into the grasslands. In the cruel and unforgiving natural world, sometimes the most unexpected bonds bring healing and hope to both sides. The story of Django and Tumba became a legend told through many generations of animals on the savannah and whispered about around human campfires. A testament that maternal love can transcend all natural boundaries, turn natural enemies into family, and prove that love in its purest and most unconditional form is always stronger than any other instinct. Years later, when Django was an old lioness, her muzzle gray with age, she would still sometimes walk to the river's edge. She would rest there in the shade, listening to the grunts and splashes of the hippopod. And sometimes a large female hippo would surface near the bank, closer than hippos usually came when lions were present. and he would watch the old lioness with what seemed like recognition and respect. The young animals who witnessed these moments didn't understand. But the older ones, who had heard the story, would nod knowingly. They understood that some bonds, forged in the crucible of loss and sealed with unconditional love, could never be broken, not by time, not by distance, not even by the fundamental laws that governed their world. Django lived a long life, full and rich with the love of her pride and the respect of all who knew her story. When her time finally came, she walked one last time to the river's edge. There she lay down in the cool shade, her breathing shallow, her amber eyes looking one last time at the waters where her extraordinary adopted son lived. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, a sound came from the river. A deep, resonant call, more powerful than any hippo call should be, filled with emotion and memory. Tumba had come as close to the bank as he dared, his massive form now that of a full-grown hippo, leader of his own family group. He called again, and Django, with the last of her strength, answered with a soft roar. In that exchange they said everything. I remember. I loved you. I love you still. Thank you for the gift of life, for the gift of love, for the gift of proving that family is not defined by blood but by the heart. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Django closed her eyes for the last time, a peaceful expression on her weathered face. She had lived fully, loved deeply, and taught the savannah that the greatest strength of all was not in claws or fangs, but in the ability to love beyond all boundaries. And on the river, Tumba remained throughout the night, a silent vigil for the mother who had defied nature itself to save him, to love him, and to let him go. His presence there, unusual and unexplained to those who didn't know the story, was his final tribute to the extraordinary bond they had shared. The legend of Django and Tumba continued to be told for generations, a story that reminded all who heard it that in a world governed by survival and predation, by territorial conflicts and the struggle for resources, there remains something more powerful. The unconditional love of a mother's heart, capable of seeing not an enemy or prey, but simply a child in need. And in responding to that need, both the giver and receiver of such love are forever transformed, forever connected, forever proof that love transcends all barriers.